Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome back from lunch. It's a pleasure. It was a great lunch. Everybody enjoy it? Yeah. And welcome to the Security and Software Development session. We'd like to kick it off with Drs. Barbara Endicott-Popovsky, excuse me, Barbara, I butchered that, from University of Washington, yeah, and Kirsten Ferguson-Boucher from Aberystwyth, yeah, very good. University in Wales. And they are going to give us a great presentation called Risk Assessment and Cloud Strategy Development.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm going to go over a little bit of background on security that's probably not news to the people in this room as a level set to describing what we're doing at the University of Washington with the Center of Information Assurance and Cybersecurity, and then segueing into our collaboration with Wales. And we're taking a slightly different view with this presentation. We're looking at some business issues. I like to start with my favorite quotes from the Chief Information Security Officer at the University of Washington. He's very fond of saying that if the internet were a street, I wouldn't walk it in daytime. I think what's most astounding is the idea that organized crime makes more money on the internet than they do from drugs. Now, I'm not sure where the FBI gets that information. I don't believe that organized crime publishes annual reports, but albeit it is a comment that they have made in presentations I have heard. So the bottom line is, from a security perspective, it's not pretty out there. We're all aware that the spectrum of threats has changed in the last 10 years. As a practitioner, I started in the security space when we were most worried about recreational hackers, the 12-year-olds that would stay up all night and cause mischief. We've now graduated to the professional hackers, of course, the organized criminals, and nation states that have a very determined motive, money, national interests, and it becomes compelling. And of course, you're all familiar with this particular chart, the famous X chart, that basically states, looking from left to right, that over time, it has taken less and less effort to execute increasingly complex attacks, basically because hackers are nothing if they're not willing to share and share their tools, making it easy for people to get aboard and do dangerous things. So what have we learned from our experiences with the internet? And I would say number one, from my perspective, is design in cybersecurity from the get-go. And when we look at the history of the internet, that was not a requirement from the beginning. We're talking about enabling sharing amongst known parties. Very quickly, as the internet became commercialized, we began to experience these unintended consequences. But cybersecurity from the beginning was not a requirement. And so what can we take to the cloud? Perhaps the same concept that we need to think about security from the beginning. Now, the center that I operate at the university takes a multidisciplinary approach. We have been involved with the legal folks, with the business folks, computer science, information science. So we basically look at a cross-disciplinary view of this problem space, and we look at this space from the user perspective, from an implementation perspective. Last year, that implementation perspective embraced the cloud for many reasons. The cloud uptake was a lot greater and faster than originally was predicted by sources like Gartner. The cloud is basically forming over Washington State, so we have a front row seat on the development of the cloud. This is fairly exciting for those of us who live here. We're witnessing a paradigm shift, and at the information school, where I mostly reside, we are preparing people to manage information systems. And we're aware that sources like Gartner are claiming that 85% of these jobs are going to go away as we know them, and that the big emphasis for implementers is going to be data and information management issues. And so this has a great deal of relevance at the university and for the position that I hold. Now let's look at what the Ponemon Institute is saying about cloud providers and how they view the security space. This report came out April in 2011, and it had some very interesting things to say. Now, I'm not saying this study isn't without its flaws. Here's a summary of findings. They're basically claiming that cloud providers overwhelmingly believe that the security problem is the user's problem. And when we look at the sample size that was queried, we see that while a large number of organizations in Europe and the UK and the American continent were queried, there was a small respondent size to that particular survey. And when we look at how cloud providers perceive themselves in their confidence in supplying security, note that they are fairly confident that they are meeting user needs for security in the cloud. But when you look at what the cloud providers perceive as the owner of the security space, they're by a majority saying that it's the cloud user that takes primary responsibility. I see a conflict there. Yes, we're doing a great job with security. Basically, this is the user's responsibility. So we have one of these things. And so when we look at the countries involved in the sample size in the European space, the study largely drew on UK participants. And when the question was asked, who is most concerned about cloud security? Is it the US or Europe? We see that perhaps Europeans are slightly more concerned. And this is consistent with experiences that we've had with other IT innovations where the Europeans watch the Americans and maybe take a more studied approach to adoption and then take the lessons learned from the Americans who embrace technology with abandon. And that's a good thing. So what I'd like to introduce is a study that was done by our UK colleagues from Aberystwyth, where they did a similar study but at a more detailed level, looking at storing information in the cloud from their perspective. Now, what's interesting about this particular study is that an extension of this research could indeed assist in accelerating uptake in the European countries, because we certainly are identifying where potential users are seeing showstoppers. So we are planning to continue this research. This initial study was chaired by my colleague, Kirsten Ferguson-Boucher.
Yes, so we started this research project last year, and the main aim was to investigate the management, operational, and technical issues. But from a record-keeping perspective, I'm based in the Department of Information Studies at Aberystwyth, so we're looking at some of the longer-term requirements for keeping the data that's being stored in the cloud. So that was one of our objectives at the beginning. But we also wanted to develop a toolkit to assist information professionals, broader informational professionals, not just the technological side, because these are people that are around the table when these decisions are made. As Barbara alluded to, the uptake has been less in Europe, and I'm not sure if that isn't a personality thing. We're a lot more circumspect, perhaps, in what we do in Europe, but also obviously we have a lot more stringent regulations which control and affect our decision-making processes. So this was the actual research methodology. We, first of all, we took quite a detailed literature review, looking specifically at information governance and assurance, though. There isn't much, which is a good thing to know. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not been something that's actually coming onto the radar until the last sort of 6 months or so. It's evidence that we're still at early adoption stage in Europe. And we also undertook a series of consultations. We did do an online questionnaire, similar to that project before, quite low response rates. We were surprised. At the same time, there was some being done in educational institutions as well. They got a slightly higher rate. But generally speaking, people are not responding quickly to say what they're doing. I think because a lot of it's not happening yet, but also because they haven't actually gone through the thought processes. So from our perspective, a good time to get involved. We also did 3 in-depth kind of case studies with the Guardian Media Group, Melrose Resources, which is quite a small organisation who look at it's kind of like security side, but also longer-term preservation issues, and also the UK government, the Cabinet Office. At the moment, we're in the process of creating a private cloud called G-Cloud. So this is something that's actually happening in the UK government at the moment. So again, people that you would hope were thinking about some of the governance and assurance issues. And we also had an event last year in Manchester, an conference where we pretty well left it to the floor to discuss some of the issues. So this is where we got quite a lot of our data from. So the survey results were not unsurprising. 30% have used cloud computing in some way, 17 are thinking about it, 41 interested but no active plans. So it's really that 41% that I would say are the interesting group. Why are they not actually engaging yet?
Sorry, do you know what the numbers are for comparable sample in the U.S.?
Actually, the Poneman Institute study ed has that. I can get you a copy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Knowing how different it actually is.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I can send you that.
Yeah, because I did look at it and I can't remember the actual figures, but it is significantly lower.
To repeat the question, yes, Ed was asking what the comparable data looked like for the U.S. in terms of adoption rates. Mm-hmm. We did have that overall number that seemed to indicate that it was different here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, the uptake is lower. These were some of the main concerns, but what's interesting here is they're not the main concerns of the IT fraternity. These are the main concerns of organisations, particularly from that information and record keeping perspective. So the first thing that actually comes up on that list is destruction of data. Perhaps surprisingly. Loss of control, perhaps not so surprisingly. Data protection, again, privacy issues are always going to be something which is a significant element in concerning organisations. But I think that first one, the destruction of data, is quite an interesting one, and one that we'll come to later in the discussion. So again, what are they? Well, the governance issues. Mentioned the privacy and the data protection one. Obviously, each country has different legislation. The EU at the moment is in the process of changing our legislation. And at the moment, however, the cloud there are significant issues with getting information and private data into the cloud, sensitive data into the cloud from a European perspective. Wider compliance issues and e-discovery. Again, European legislation is a lot more complex in a lot of ways. We're more circumspect in what we do. So these perhaps impact quite heavily. You've got things like confidentiality and the ability to audit service, which again I'll come back to as well. Loss of control over data. So really what we were saying from the data that we'd collected is people are quite willing to engage in the cloud, but it's a risk assessment exercise and it's building these trust relationships. So again, play at your own risk. And I suppose what we're interested in is how do you actually then make these risk assessments? We had a top 10 set that came out of our research, which were the top 10 questions. I've got 2 slides on that, which I'll not go through, but there's a summary here. They basically cluster into questions that relate to performance, specifically efficiency and cost, which you would expect, monitoring and total costs. Obviously, organisations are going to be concerned with that. But there are quite a lot that relate to alignment of organisational objectives. How do you actually look at that responsibility and the impact of the outsourcing? Those are associated with, coming back to Barbara's talk before, the information assurance and value element. How are we actually using the information in the cloud to bring value to the organisation? And finally, that risk, which again we'll come back to. So it is clear that a lot of the findings, why people aren't getting involved in the cloud, relate specifically to information governance and assurance, i.e. the handling of data in the cloud. And decisions can only be taken in a wider context within organisations. So what we're, in terms of our research, looking at now is what is this complex structure of assessments? It isn't just specifically the implementation of that IT in terms of being a solution for that particular IT problem. It's more about value, alignment, performance and assurance of all information within this wider framework. So I've come up with this vapor. I've just put there how to pronounce it because it looks a bit odd. But it's really about the value of information, alignment with business objectives, assurance and proving that you're actually meeting those kind of assurance requirements in a performance and risk framework. So it's a holistic approach to information governance and assurance. Part of this model also attempts to take advantage of the changes in user practice. we've seen a lot of changes as a result of social media. Depending on the nature of organisations, it's a lot harder to actually instruct people in terms of what they should be doing to meet a lot of these objectives, because users are used to operating differently in their own home environments. They don't expect to come into the workplace now and be given a lot of regulations and governance in terms of how they operate. We've also tried to kind of work in conjunction with existing processes and procedures in the organisations, because again, making those kind of changes is quite difficult. But we are trying to add value within this performance and risk framework. So what we did within the toolkit is we divided it into 3 sections. We've looked at preparing to go into the cloud, managing, and then ultimately operating in the cloud. This is actually a summary of Microsoft's toolkit, which looked at data governance, privacy, confidentiality, and compliance. So actually Microsoft are a bit ahead of the game in that they are starting to think about these sorts of issues. You can see the kind of ways they've approached it, which is a kind of interesting comparison. And there are other governance papers and literature that is starting to appear about cloud specifically. But what we've done is try and actually give people something hands-on that they can do through each of the stages. So you're looking at preparing things like information classification. I'm talking here not just in terms of security classification, I mean actually providing classifications that enable you to find information afterwards, risk assessments, then actually when managing in the cloud, and I'm going to look in a bit more detail in a minute at the information management one, compliance, contract, cost monitoring, and then operating in the cloud. So I'll leave these slides there, they're there for reference afterwards, but basically that's about your legal framework, and this is where Europe perhaps has more issues. Existing internal systems, the IT infrastructure, and your central business drivers. And I've highlighted classification there because how your information goes into the cloud in terms of storage is how it's going to come out. So there are some significant issues for organisations. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Sorry. Just going to go back because I overshot by about 16 slides, I think, roughly. I'll come back to that bit. So there are 2 slides on operating, and I'm going to just go to this one. So I thought, as an example, this is the kind of thing that's in the toolkit. So if you take that heading that talks about information management, the structure of our particular toolkit starts with a consideration, each of the topics. So in this particular instance, you're looking at information stored in the cloud. How's it going to be managed in terms of the organisation's existing management systems? So you're looking at authenticity, reliability, and integrity of information over time, and also ensuring that it's accessible. Put in the over time thing here because there seems to be a lot of talk about what's happening now, of course, which is very relevant. But from information management and record keeping, you're looking at longer issues. It's not just how the data is being accessed and used now, it's how it's going to be accessed and used for the foreseeable future. If you think about pension records, for example, people always think of this as being kind of archival or some sort of issue for far into the future, but really each organisation has things like pension records. You need to know exactly how they're being managed over the entire life cycle of that information. So the rationale. So the organisation needs to ensure that policies and procedures surrounding that are there for the whole life cycle of the organisation. We talk here about classification, appraisal and disposal of information. That one that came up as number 1 in terms of what information management professionals are worried about. So the kinds of questions that we've actually got in the toolkit are, what impact will the management of information stored in the cloud have? Can we get some sort of assurance? A lot of issues that relate to the contracts at the moment, which is they're very much a kind of one-size-fits-all contract. Doesn't necessarily apply to each organisation. These are the sorts of questions that organisations need to be able to answer. And can we actually show that things have been encrypted or protected? So it's more of an evidence base. These, again, are questions that relate specifically to making and fixing information in the cloud. What's been created, what are the implications for it? If there's metadata to be attached, is it different metadata that we need in the cloud? And for keeping and seeking, i.e. you're searching for information but keeping it for the longer term, I'm talking full classification here. Have we actually got enough information there that you can get everything that relates to these sorts of processes out? Things like retention and disposal schedules, how is it going to be destroyed? And the preservation needs, which I touched on before, these longer term retention. Can it be does it need to be transferred to a digital archive? If you've got, say, governmental information, that should be going into an archival storage. Or is there a place of legal deposit? Is it just going to have a shorter term requirement, or should it remain in the cloud? Are there ways of actually preserving the information in the cloud? So it comes back to this kind of risk context. I've tried to kind of neutralise a lot of terms here because a lot of things come with understandings from different disciplines. But your legal risks are really about ensuring that you've got the right stuff, including the context in which it was created. Content's one thing, but if you don't know when things are created, that whole metadata and structure side of things, you need to think about that in terms of legal requirements. The structural risk, if you haven't got your systems and architecture for that particular information, needs to be managed through the life cycle. Systems risks, and finally the business risk. If we don't monitor these activities, and this is perhaps where we're coming back to the contracts, we need to be able to see how they are actually being monitored and have evidence, not only that we've checked it, but that we know it's being done. So it's that kind of risk framework. We've talked about the quadrants there, or I've talked about business, legal, system and structural quadrants. So just drilling down there, you can have controls that work within the organisation. They relate mainly to sort of access issues, both enabling access but also withholding access if appropriate. And it links to that concept of authenticity. Legal quadrant, again, you're looking at checks, but it's about appraisal. It's about appraising the information that we hold. There are cost implications for putting everything into the cloud, organisational ones, and also accessing information afterwards. Things like data protection, you're not supposed to hold information for longer than it's actually going to be required or was stated to be required. So you need to be able to destroy it and know that it's been destroyed and it's maintained confidentiality over that period. Go back to the context, can you get at it? Is it classified? Can you ensure that during that period it's been reliably looked after and that there is a kind of integrity framework to it? And then finally the containers. How are you going to preserve it for the longer time and will it be available? So some of the solutions that come from my neck of the woods, as in the information management side, under your checks, you've got things like appraisal. We're talking retention and disposal schedules. Quite simplistic tools in one way, but basically it applies your entire legal framework to the data that you hold. You have an overview of the organisation data that's held and you know what you need to keep for how long. That needs to be addressed specifically. In terms of context, it is things like classification, your record plans, your thesauri. How do you access that information? The controls from the access and security side, well, Barbara has touched on that, but there are it's not just the security side, it's also that knowledge management element, which is the presentation that we were at the, it was the iSchool.
The icon.
Yeah, that's right. We had somebody from Microsoft that came to that and talked about the encryption side. You can encrypt, but you need also to be able to access the data afterwards. They were looking at ways and means of actually being able to search the data afterwards. So proper encryption is great. You can't get at it, but then you can't actually get at it. So you need to be able to. So it's that sort of enabling as well as securing perspective. And then I think I mentioned before the containers. How are we going to do that? So really what Barbara and I have come to now is what do we want to do? The toolkit's available. That toolkit's available, and I've at the end of the slide, I've given the websites, etc., for accessing that. So if you're an organisation, there are a series of questions that you can ask to get you started, but it is very much preliminary research. What we want to look at now takes it one stage further, and it's issues relating to this kind of trust and understanding element. Cloud is very much a buzzword. Most organisations want to think about it because it sounds quite sexy and it might be interesting. They're not at a point where they're thinking about what exactly does that mean and how can I systematically look at what I'm going to do with my data. So certainly in Europe, as I said, I'm not sure if that is related to our, we're slightly more circumspect, but the engagement hasn't been as significant. So perhaps these sorts of governance and assurance frameworks might encourage more uptake. So what we want to do is broaden that particular toolkit to include these wider information governance dimensions, which are of concern to organisations. But it's not just really about the cloud. I mean, obviously the cloud is the new business model for the here and now. But these sorts of governance issues don't really alter depending on the technology. So if you get this kind of information assurance structure right, it should be applicable regardless of the technology that's actually being used. So we're thinking about that kind of genericizing for all information, regardless of format, which would hopefully take us forward. So that's our contact information if people obviously want to get in touch, and we do have a section for questions. I'm actually just nipping on to say that the cloud, the resources are available at that website. We do quite an extensive literature review, and there is an opportunity to contribute if you wanted to add more things to our delicious tags, although ironically, not quite sure what's happening with delicious, are we now? But that's where we were putting everything. The unconference is available, and the toolkit's actually available at their website as well. So just wanted to point that out, and we'll go back to questions.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions.
Sorry, did I pick up speed?
No, it's okay.
Yes.
Yep.
So I'm interested in the extent to which you think uptake in Europe is impeded by the fact that the cloud today is largely hosted in the United States or by U.S. companies. And I've heard that there are a set of legal framework issues. For example, what's the status of data in motion as it gets forwarded along? The fact that, say, European data stored in the United States might be subject to U.S. disclosure laws,
Right.
even if it's data, or maybe even
Correct.
data in a server owned by a U.S. company located elsewhere, blah,
Yeah.
blah. You know,
That's
we have
correct.
I think the pattern's changing a bit because a lot of the vendors are starting to say where the data is actually held. But of course, the benefit of the cloud is that it's scalable and you put the data wherever. But from a European perspective, we have to know it has to be within the 27 countries of the European Union. And if it's not held within those boundaries, then things like data protection legislation, you're in breach. So yeah, we have really quite specific. Having said all of that, there's European initiatives going through at the moment that are looking at how we can address that, because realistically, it's quite limiting in terms of the data. But yes, and obviously you're then, once you move into the other jurisdictions, you're actually having to negotiate per jurisdiction, which is, you know, really, it's quite limiting, to say the least. So yes, you're losing a lot of the benefits of the cloud on that basis. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? One here.
Oh.
Here you go.
Sorry.
In your surveys, I wonder if you noticed or did you have any indication of different attitude between small, medium enterprises and large organizations?
Interestingly, that's my personal next set of research, which is to look at some of the impact factors, because I think size of organisation is quite significant. I think type of organisation, but these are very much feelings that I got, hunches from having done this research. We didn't specifically look at those questions. So that's my next set of research, is to look at the specific impact factors. I think size of organisation, I think type of data. I suspect that the kinds of information projects that are being undertaken, we've seen loads of applications here over the last 2 days, but I think the kinds of actual implementations and uses that are being put to, I think that will be quite significant in terms of impact factors. So I have a series now. I'm also looking at different geographical locations, back to that question. I want to look at Europe, US, and I want to look at, say, India as an example of how this sort of Asian, it may vary in the different continents and things. So I think there are quite a lot of impact factors, and I don't think you can genericise to a certain degree in terms of asking the right questions, but I think it's very much down to context. And that, I think, to me, and as I said, it applies to the cloud, but it'll apply to any other new technology or new kind of technological business model as time moves on. So yes, definitely. There's an impact, but I can't prove it yet. I will do.
Okay, we have time for one quick question, if there's one out there. Okay, I see none. So please join me in thanking Drs. Endicott-Popovsky and Ferguson-Boucher. Thank you. Okay, we'll just take a very brief time here to... My mic is working, is it? Is that working? Okay, it'll be just a couple seconds here. We got to get load the other presentation onto the laptop.
My name is Ruan. I'm from University College Dublin, Center for Cybercrime Investigation. I'm not a doctor yet. I'm a PhD candidate, and I hope to finish my PhD by the end of this year. So today I'm going to give the audience a brief introduction on the research I've been doing throughout my PhD. I started to look at the problem of cloud forensics and the digital investigation in the cloud 2 years ago, since I began to do my PhD work. Basically, it concerns how to carry out digital investigation in cloud computing environments. And after 2 years, I think I figured out that this is going to take me maybe 10 years more to work on this area, because it's so big and green, and nothing really has been done yet in this area. So basically, my PhD will be my dissertation will be like a lot of questions and ideas on how to solve this problem. So these are some of the co-authors of the paper I will be mentioning in this talk. Mark Crosby is a security architect from IBM Ireland. Joshua James is my colleague in the research center. Ibrahim Bagheli is a professor at Zaid University from UAE, and Professor Joe Casey is the head of computer science and informatics in UCD, and he's also the director of the research center. Taha Kachedi is Joe Casey is my supervisor, and Taha Kachedi is my co-supervisor from UCD. And I'm funded by Oxet and EADS, this company which is building Airbuses. Sounds very cool. Digital investigation in the cloud. So what is digital investigation in the cloud? Basically, I think in the future, cyberspace will be powered by the cloud. So digital investigation in the cloud is more or less the future of digital investigation in the cyberspace. And it's a very wide area, because it's not only about prosecuting the cyber criminals, it's also about how to find out what's going on in the cloud. Which is the concern of many people who are now thinking about adopting cloud computing or already using cloud computing, how to figure out what's going on, what happened in the cloud. So cloud computing provides us with global interconnection, openness, and interoperability. And at the same time, it provides the criminals more easier access to the cyberspace and more safe havens. In the future, consumer, business, political, scientific, and educational activities will be powered by cloud computing, and the cybercrime is estimated to have $105 billion value per year. It's bigger than drug dealing, as mentioned by the previous speaker. But at the same time, law enforcement is not catching up as usual and as we expected, because it's very hard to play catch up with the bad guys. I was reading an article 2 days ago on why the bad guys is hard to catch, because they just need to try to break the vase, and they just need to catch one chance, and they can do that. But for the good guys to catch them, they have to succeed 100% of the time, which is very challenging. And digital evidence is still, the admissibility of digital evidence in the court is still a very complicated issue, especially comes to cloud computing. So this is a very recent document from the White House from Obama, International Strategy for Cyberspace, issued last month. And it's mentioned in this document that states must identify and prosecute cyber criminals to ensure laws and practices deny criminals safe havens, and cooperate with international criminal investigations in a timely manner. This seems to be a goal for U.S. as a country, and a long-term strategy for the cyberspace, but it's a very complicated issue concerning lots of technical challenges, organizational challenges, and international collaboration. And basically now we still cannot even answer this question, what happened and what is happening in the cloud, which is very basic, fundamental to achieve this goal. So there's a long way to go. As I was carrying out my research at the beginning, I made a simulated cloud myself, and it's a very small project. And I was trying to simulate some crimes and simulate some crimes and try to figure out how to go through the investigation process in the simulated cloud. And then I discovered that it's just nonsense, because cloud computing is much more than a technical issue. It's a lot of interaction with the provider, and a lot of things between the provider and the customer, and a lot of issues regarding multi-jurisdictional, multi-tenant legal problems. So by doing a little project in my lab on my own cannot really solve this problem. So, and then I published a paper on cloud forensics and an overview, trying to describe what are the major dimensions for cloud forensics. So firstly, I discussed about the technical dimension of cloud forensics, which basically is the mapping the traditional digital forensic process into cloud environment. This graphic is from NIST. Although the digital investigation experts haven't really agreed on what are the standard digital forensic process, but this one is from a respected organization, so I just used that one. So basically, the digital forensic process is from collection, examination, analysis to reporting, and the preservation of evidence should cover all the 4 phases. And in each of the phases, there are different techniques and procedures associated with each phase. So we should look at how to map all these phases into the cloud, which is very challenging. In the collection phase, we need to consider proactive collection of evidence, which need to be agreed between the provider and the customer on how to proactively collect data before the incident. And so there are client-side artifacts, there are provider-side artifacts for data collection, and there are numerous data sources. There are 4 billion mobile endpoints now accessing the internet, and the physical locations is very hard to be located, and also sampling, time synchronization in the cloud. In the examination phase, it concerns evidence segregation among different tenants who are sharing same resources, and traceability, how to trace an event that is happened in the cloud, and how to filter numerous data that is collected from the collection phase into something useful, and pattern matching, which is identifying potential criminal patterns in the data that is collected. And data reduction, it's similar to filtering. Basically, it's reducing the size of the sampled data. And then analysis, it concerns data mining, reconstruction, event reconstruction, which is a very cool thing to think about. It's like a crime scene investigation, how to reconstruct the crime scene in the cloud. And time sequence, there is still a huge problem with time synchronization over the cloud. And at the same time, time sequence is crucial to forensic analysis because it determines which incident happened before and after the sequence of incidents. And finally, reporting, it concerns documentation and presentation of evidence, potentially to the court, and expert testimony. In the preservation, it means chain of custody, which is very complicated in the cloud, admissibility, which is under discussion, how to define the admissibility of the evidence from the cloud, soundness of the evidence, transport of the evidence, storage of the data collected, and how to destroy and how to make sure things are destroyed, and the case management of the forensic case. So this is the technical dimension, which is a mess because there are numerous challenges in this dimension. And then we kind of emphasized 5 main areas of focus on the technical dimension that we think are unique and are unique to the cloud nature. And other techniques, basically, it's either we need to scale the current techniques up or we just need to kind of transform it into the cloud environment. So these 5 main areas are forensic data collection in the cloud because of the data sources are numerous and there is the segregation of duty between the cloud provider and the cloud customer, so it becomes very challenging. And then elastic, static, and live forensic toolkits, because cloud is elastic, so the forensic cases can be elastic too, and how to make the tools and procedures elastic, and how to provide static and live forensics tools for large-scale data centers and so on. Evidence segregation, that concerns how to completely segregate data from different tenants when it comes to investigation, because when your neighbor is committing a crime, you don't want your data to be investigated because you are not related to that crime. But how to make sure that your confidentiality is not breached when there is investigation on your neighbor. Investigative tools in virtualized environments. Virtualization is crucial to cloud computing. It's very unique from cloud computing as well. So how to investigate, for example, hypervisors, because hypervisors will be a single point of failure to some extent, and it's very much liked by the hackers. Proactive preparations, which means how to define the procedures and processes to proactively collect forensic relevant data before incident happen. and how to collaborate in collecting them between provider and customer. And then there is this organizational dimension of cloud forensics. And in this chart, it's basically describing how these different parties are interacting in this game. Within the cloud organization, there are 4 different roles: investigators, incident handlers, law advisors, IT professionals. We assume that every organization, they have their forensic team, but many organizations, they don't have this forensic team. And then they will resort to external assistance when needed, when it comes to techniques that they cannot provide internally. And then between the cloud organizations, there is SLA binding and defining the roles and responsibilities of each organization. And in this chain of CSPs and customers, they interact with law enforcement, third parties, and academia. So the complicated thing here is the dependencies between provider and customer, because provider might depend on other provider to provide some services. And then when there's investigation, it's very hard to investigate through this chain, and there is nothing defined yet. No policies, no agreement to facilitate any kind of investigation that is happening in this kind of situation. So basically the areas of focus here is first segregation of duties between providers and customer, and also between the law enforcement and the chain of providers and customer. And also basically it's about defining roles and responsibilities in this big interactive environment. And then collaboration, how to facilitate effective and efficient collaboration, and how to come up with policies, both organizational policy and also from international level, how to provide the policies for these investigations to be carried out effectively. And then the legal dimension, of course, is very important, because now with the cloud, everything will be more multi-jurisdictional than before, because before when you have a network on your own premise, it's only one jurisdiction. But now multi-jurisdiction can be a default setting for any kind of investigation, because if people are moving to the cloud, then your data is by default multi-jurisdictional. And multi-tenancy is about how to investigate a case when they are sharing resources among more than one customer, and this is unique to cloud computing as well, quite unique. And multi-ownership, it comes to who actually owns this piece of data, and then when the data is seized by law enforcement, who is going to react on this and who is responsible to react. Then service level agreement, everything, this is the legal binding document for cloud computing, so everything should be finally defined in SLA on how to address these questions. And then this year I did a survey towards the digital forensic experts around the world to ask their opinions on cloud forensics, because I was very confused myself, and I can't really say that I think this is like this, so it's like this. So basically we carried a survey on cloud forensics and critical criteria for cloud forensic capability. It was launched in February, and up to March, after 1 month, we received 156 responses, which is amazing for this community, because there are not too many. The digital forensic experts community is not too big for now. And then we have almost 200 responses up to now. So I did a preliminary analysis on the result. So I'm going to share some key findings. So basically, 50% of the experts believe that cloud makes forensics harder. The main reasons are loss of data control. The customers are putting data to the cloud, then they don't know what's going on. No access to physical infrastructure. You can't touch the machines, you can't touch the disk, etc. Legal issues of multi-jurisdiction, multi-tenancy, and multi-ownership. Lack of tools for large-scale distributed and virtualized systems. No standard interface for investigation. There's no tool provided by the providers. No provider cooperation. Most of the providers are not transparent on investigations, and they are not providing any tools now to investigate. Difficulties in producing forensically sound and admissible evidence in court. This is quite a difficulty in traditional forensics, but it's even more challenging in cloud environment. And then very interestingly, 42% of experts believe that cloud makes forensics easier. The reason why is that they believe more computing resources and processing power with reduced cost will help forensics. And rapidly scalable auditing, reporting, and testing analysis can be used for larger data sets and distributed applications. Basically, forensics can also take advantage of the computer power provided by cloud computing. Forensic implications and activities can be centrally administered and managed. Centralization is good for forensics because it provides certain standardization as well. Investigations can be provided as a service by the CSP. I know some people who are doing research on forensics as a service, and it's very promising because in this way, more people will be benefited from standard forensic tools and procedures. I personally believe, I'm personally optimistic. I can't say that I believe it makes it easier, but I'm optimistic. So 84% of the experts agree that there is a technical dimension of cloud forensics. 84% agree there is legal dimension, and 75% believes that there is organizational dimension. So my three-dimensional model is validated by the opinions from the experts. So the top 5 challenges for cloud forensics, according to the experts, are first, jurisdiction. 90% of the experts believe jurisdiction is a major challenge. And then investigating external chain of dependencies of the cloud providers. As I mentioned before, when the provider is depending on other providers to provide certain service, and it's almost impossible to carry out investigation in such a complicated environment. And then lack of international collaboration and legislative mechanism in cross-nation data access and exchange. And then lack of law and legal advisory. Then finally, decreased access to and control over forensic data at all levels from customer side. Although most of the customers are still not aware of their lack of control over forensics data, but experts believe this is a major challenge. And then the top 3 opportunities, according to the experts, are, first of all, establishment of a foundation of standards and policies, which I strongly believe it's a good opportunity given by the adoption of cloud computing to the digital forensic research and development. And then forensics as a cloud service, and certainly cost-effective forensic implementations as part of cloud infrastructure. So we can see, compared to the challenges, they're all above 70%, but the opportunities are around 50%. Top 3 most valuable research directions, according to the experts in cloud forensics, are first, design forensic architecture for the cloud, which I'm working on right now in my dissertation. The question is, we need a new novel architecture or some architecture that is evolved from the architecture we have now. And then extending current investigative tools into the cloud, certainly law. So the top 5 most needed tools and procedures, according to the experts, are procedures and tools to preserve the soundness of digital evidence in the cloud and retrieve forensics data involving confidential data under jurisdictions and agreements which services are operating. So basically, it's about you need to understand where your data is in terms of the jurisdictions and agreements that is restricting, which is defining how to retrieve confidential data, because in different jurisdictions it's different. So it can be very complicated when your data is all over the place. Then investigative external chain of dependencies we talked about before, and preserve volatile data in the cloud, the data that is changing every second, and then proactively collect forensics data. So these are the tools that need to be developed, most needed. And then service level agreement. So I recently wrote a paper on key terms that need to be included in the SLA for cloud forensics, and it's going to be published soon. Basically covered 6 major sections. First, we need to discuss what is the cloud offering, because in different cloud offerings, the investigations are different. The customer has a bigger control in the case of infrastructure as a service, because they still have control over infrastructure above. They have access to logs and stuff, and they have less control in software as a service, because the provider is taking responsibility of most of the things. And we need to consider what kind of operations are put in the cloud, and this is like the basic things we need to discuss before defining the rest of the SLA. And then there are 4 different areas. First is access to forensics data. Who has access to the encryption keys, and when there is investigation, how to decrypt the forensics data, and how to access these keys, and how to work with these people who have access to the keys, and what are the rights for the investigators to access these keys, and logs on all levels, physical location, access to physical location, physical infrastructure, access to disk images and other forensics data generated by the provider, and the proactive forensics data collection. So this should be considered. This kind of access to forensics data need to be considered. And then technical dimension mainly is first proactive preparation and forensics data collection, transparency of data collection, how data is collected, and the roles and responsibilities between the provider and customer on data collection, and forensics tools, what kind of tools are provided by the provider, and what kind of tools are needed from the customer, are the responsibility of the customer to provide. And then evidence segregation, how the evidence is segregated, is it agreed between the provider and the customer regarding this issue. Virtual environment and hypervised investigation, what kind of tools are provided in this area, and the customer and provider need to agree on this investigation in virtual environment. And data deletion, how data is deleted, how to make sure data is deleted, and how to prove it's deleted. Because we know that it's hard to delete even a piece of data on a computer, and how to delete data in the cloud, it can be very challenging. And incident response and recovery, what are the incident response plans and recovery plans for investigation and security breach? In the organizational dimension, the staffing structure between the provider and the customer need to be defined. Who is providing what, and who is responsible for what, and who is providing the staff to do investigation and to react to law enforcement. And then forensics training, who is taking care of trainings, collaboration, how to facilitate collaborations internally between the teams in the organization, and collaboration externally with other providers and with law enforcement. External assistance, in which cases external assistance are resorted to, and what kind of services they're providing, and what kind of problems they are helping the provider or customer to solve. This needs to be clearly stated in the SLA. And transparency of chain of dependencies, what kind of what kind of dependencies is involved in this service, and what are the other providers you are using in providing these services. In legal dimension, mainly it's discussion on issues around multi-jurisdiction, multi-tenancy, chain of custody, who is taking care of the evidence and preserving the evidence, notification when there is law enforcement coming with a warrant, and within how much time the customer or the provider is notified, and notified so that they can react to it. About resource seizure, when law enforcement want to seize a piece of resources, who is going to react and how to react. Forensic soundness, how to preserve the soundness of the evidence, and admissibility, change of CSP, when there is a change of the provider, how to deal with this when it comes to investigation. And then all these need to be audited. So basically this is about the SLA, which is not existing now, but we are trying to make an effort to to define more terms for forensics in the SLA for cloud computing. And then this is the project I'm working on now. It's called Cloud Forensic Capability Model. We are trying to define a model that is used to assess the capability of a provider or customer in their maturity in cloud forensics. And we are working with several providers trying to validate this model. Yeah, hopefully this will be something like a standard that people can refer to. Some of the initiatives I'm working on, collective knowledge. I'm editing a book on cloud forensics. It's going to be published next year, early next year. It's called Cybercrime and the Cloud Forensics Application for Investigative Processes. I have received some very interesting chapters on the R&D in this area, and I'm going to edit the volume 2 of this book next year, so it will be out in 2013. And we are building a cloud forensics network of experts around the world who are developing various tools and procedures in cloud forensics. And because I believe this area is not, one person cannot definitely deal with it, so we need collective knowledge and build a community of experts who can share their research and ideas and work together to develop tools and solutions for this. And I'm working on an e-journal of cloud forensic research, which is backed up by the research center in UCD. And case studies, tool development, benchmark project, and standard SLA. And finally, I need to finish my dissertation by the end of the year. So that's very important. And so if anybody is interested in working with me, I'm happy to discuss. Thank you.
Keyun, this is a very fascinating topic and full of complex issues.
I'm sorry, I was so nervous.
Oh, no, you weren't nervous at all. It was great. Are there any questions of Keyun? Oh, there have to be. This is a fascinating area. There's one.
So in all your research, it basically comes down to if you want to do forensics, you have to load your own stuff to, as a person who's going to be using a cloud service provider. You can't really trust. You can't trust the cloud service providers to do forensics for you. You have to do it yourself.
No. I think the key is in collaboration, and also the key is in the segregation of duties. I personally believe actually the provider do forensics for you is more trusting, more reliable in some sense, because security and forensics in small and medium enterprises are very weak. But if they are using cloud computing, then they can actually jump to a standard kind of infrastructure, like Google, Amazon, Microsoft. They will provide a standard security forensics implementations. And then these small and medium companies and also like smaller companies, they can actually afford this kind of implementation with very low cost. And that's actually a good thing. So I'm personally optimistic about cloud computing, although there are many challenges, but I don't believe that we should go back to the time that we lock everything in the black box and believe that is secure. I think we should move forward and develop architecture, framework, and tools for the new technology. So.
Question up here. One moment. Let's go ahead. You go ahead, and then you.
Do you see law firms and accounting firms offering most of these services?
No. Well, but I mean, they should be aware of what are the problems, and I believe that more people will start to work on this. And I'm very happy because at the beginning when I was starting to do this research, I basically started from reading an article from Newsweek, and then I was like 2 years ago when cloud computing was still emerging, and I was like, yeah, this is interesting, and I told my supervisor, so I can do cloud forensics, and inventing a new term is so cool. and then I started to do my research, and I felt lonely all the time because at the beginning there were not people like even thinking about cloud forensics, and I was like making them aware of the potential problems and all this. But now I'm happy that people are actually writing emails to me saying that at least I found someone is working on this, and this is really important, and we have encountered some cases related to cloud computing, and I think this will be relevant in the near future. So, and more researchers are working on this area. So I'm quite happy. And I believe that more people, like lawyers or, I mean, people will start to work on this.
Okay, we'll take one last question over here. And as he's preparing, I mean, there are some interesting terms like computational agriculture. That's a cool one too. I wish I was the guy who coined that term.
So it seems that it's difficult enough to think of jurisdiction when it comes to traditional crime like hacking into accounts to get credit cards. Have you looked into or thought about things that actually enter into foreign policy? Like, for example, companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft almost have to define their own implicit foreign policy with respect to what's happening in the Middle East, or with respect to attacks that seem to be originating from China or things like that.
Yeah, I don't talk about China because I'm from China. Yeah, that's very relevant thought because actually I think cyberspace will be empowering not only businesses, education, and research. It will be also empowering politics in some sense because everything will be digital in the future. And there are research and discussion on digital diplomacy, digital foreign policies, and all these kind of things. And that's very interesting for me. And actually, I was looking at some of the issues related to social media, social network, with political movements and all this. And cloud computing will be behind all these kind of things. So some people say there should be a political dimension of cloud forensics or a social dimension of cloud forensics, which are very interesting. But I think now it's not a major concern yet. So I think compared to the 3 dimensions I defined, these are still kind of marginal in a sense. But in the future, maybe we need to include these 2 dimensions too, depending on how technology is evolving. But these are very interesting. I'm really excited about this.
Keyun, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, we'll get the next fellow queued up here. Joris, how are you? Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Joris Poort. He's from Harvard Business School, and he's going to talk about what I believe is a very timely subject and interesting as well, cloud-based product development.
Great,
Thanks.
Thanks. So I think my background's a little bit misleading. My bachelor's is in mechanical engineering, and I did my master's in aerospace engineering, and I worked for several years at Boeing. So with the title of this is cloud-based product development, with the products being actual physical products, such as airplanes and cars and things like that. So if you're coming for a pure software development talk, you can still feel free to leave. But basically, so that's my background. What I spent most of my career working on was the 787 airplane. I worked on several different sections. Most of it was on the wing. And the problem we were trying to solve in product development, in designing an airplane, and the same applies for many other products, is thinking about how the different disciplines, such as aerodynamics or manufacturing or structures, interact with each other in the design process. So a big piece, and this is what this work is, a lot of this is about, is how can you, when you link all these together, you create an extremely big computational problem. How can you solve that, and some of the work in that area. So first, just to give you a little bit more background, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the aerospace industry, but basically with the Boeing 787, it's been quite a headache. If you're from around here, you probably read too much about this already. But it's costing companies in aerospace a lot of money, and it's not just Boeing. Airbus has the same issues. And a lot of it has to do with different issues within the product development process. And from a business perspective, this is costing them a lot of money. But it's not just in aerospace industry. It's really in many other industries, in manufacturing and high tech. And some research has been done on this, and it actually looks into looking at what the long-term effects are of these development delays in the products. And it's actually 5% drop in long-term market cap. So beyond just missing your deadlines and the damage from that, it really is irreparable damage to the companies themselves. So this is why this is a big issue in business. And the root causes, and again, this is from research across manufacturing high-tech companies, root causes for this are technical and engineering problems, needing to redesign the product, not meeting performance spec, kind of the typical kinds of things that you would expect. And I actually think, and that's what I'll propose here, is that the cloud can help address many of these issues. And I'll explain why and how. On top of this, there's actually growing opportunities, because this is a growing problem. And the reason it's a growing problem, if you look at globalization and outsourcing, it's really making the entire supply chain within these companies, and it's making the actual design process much more complex. On top of that, you have different advances. So in aerospace, you have things like composite materials. It adds the many variables to the problem, and along with the integration problems within the supply chain, it makes this an extremely large and unpredictable process doing this product development. So while all this has been changing, the traditional product development process has actually been staying the same. And it's really just the same process has been used for the last 15 years. So what that actually looks like is, you just start with a concept, and this comes from, some research group that decides something like the 787 is the next plane they want to build. Then goes to a detailed design phase. You have different analysis disciplines. So here you have things like aerodynamics. They do computational fluid dynamic analysis, which is basically, that's simulated, often done in high performance clusters. And that feeds back onto that detailed design. So within the aerodynamic group, they come up with the perfect airfoil shape, and they feed that back. It goes through other analysis disciplines, things like structures that decide, what is the actual structure on the inside, and how to get that certified with the FAA. And these each keep iterating like this, and this is a very long process. You converge to a final design, and then that's what gets built. So these analysis disciplines each happen within engineering silos. They can be quite complex, and for example, in aerodynamics, there will be a group of hundreds of engineers that work on perfecting the perfect shape for an airplane. And they work in a silo and in perfecting the aerodynamics, and the same thing for many other disciplines. And so this is really where all the time is spent, and this is where we'll try to improve this through using cloud computing. And also, an important thing to understand is that most of the actual decisions for the products get made very early on in the product development cycle. So really, all your constraints are already defined very early in this process, and that's in the conceptual phase. So how we're going to change this with cloud-based product development, it's similar first stages, but when we get to the analysis disciplines, which are things like, on the top you see something like computational fluid dynamics, which defines the shape, and then analysis discipline, something like finite element analysis to do the structural analysis. These all actually work off the same airplane, obviously, and many of the same variables. So there's a discipline called multidisciplinary optimization where you can try to tie these together. And that's a lot of what the cloud enables, is doing this practically on a real industry problem. So this has been around for a long time. Academics have done this before. But the practical reality behind linking all these simulations, if you envision something like an expensive computational fluid dynamic run, requires already a high-performance grid to be able to do that. Every time you add a dimension, it's really, adding another entire dimension to this computational requirement. So when you link 3 or 4 together, it becomes so big, it's basically impossible to solve. But what we're doing with a cloud platform, now all of a sudden your computational capabilities are much larger than they were before with the grid. And even large companies, such as Boeing and Lockheed Martin, they all have large supercomputers and grids to be able to solve these type of problems. But these come nowhere close to the computing power that's necessary to solve if you really tie everything together in a practical problem. So what we're doing is we have these dynamic integrated databases, which is really just storing all this data and relating them to each other. So it is a database that understands where data is coming from and how they relate to each other. Then we have a suite of kind of computation tools. A lot of them have to do with optimization. They're not extremely complex, relatively simple algorithms, and cloud computing resources to solve this. And so these are tied together, and then each of these analysis disciplines interacts with these databases and these solvers. And through this process, they're also interacting with each other. So you're seeing the effects of, in aerodynamics, you're changing the shape of an airfoil, how that affects all the subsequent processes downstream. So how it affects how you design the structure, how it affects how the manufacturing process happens, and different constraints that are from those processes. That converges to a final design and goes to production. So, why hasn't this been adopted? Well, basically, the fundamentals have been around for a very long time. And like I said, academic research has shown that this is very doable. But the problem is when you go to a real practical problem, the amount of design variables in like a wing for the variables that are used to do certification by the FAA are very large. So you can think of millions of different designing variables. And then on top of that, on every design variable or every local area that you have to provide analysis for, you have many, many different constraints. So this problem becomes extremely large. And academic work has shown it's possible, but it wasn't really until with the 787, and this is actually on a derivative version of the 787, that we, for the first time, solved something, really practical problem in industry that was actually applied on the derivative airplane. And I'll share some of those results a little bit later. But really, not until after that, we used clusters to do this. So high-performance clusters, no cloud. And now that cloud computing has become available, this really disrupts the entire cost structure to do these type of problems, but also lets Boeing do problems that previously weren't possible before. So many people would argue that, high-performance computing, why are you using the cloud to do this? But the reality is that very large problems, even, you could say theoretically you have access to very large grids, but the practical realities are, with cloud computing, this becomes extremely accessible, and before they're not, even within companies. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but to bring everybody to the same level. So why do you virtualize high-performance computing? So I've mentioned a couple of reasons. But most people only talk about the problems. And most people that do high-performance computing, they really prefer not to do it on the cloud or virtualized. And the reason is that there's obviously the security issues, which in aerospace and defense get even bigger than the typical issues. Performance scalability, so there are performance issues in certain cases, and different integration problems. But as I'll show is, if you can overcome these, and I think each of these is very easy to address and think about as a company and how to address those through different methods. But the benefits are much larger than some of the risks you're taking, especially if you compare it to doing it on a cluster. So the new opportunities that they really provide is, again, this accessibility. And I think people underestimate this. And perhaps in academia, it's relatively easy to get access to large clusters or recreate your problem so it becomes practical on whatever resources you do have. In industry, these very large problems just don't get solved because very easily people say, well, it's not possible. So what cloud computing does is it really provides this to the engineers within the companies. And it does actually provide a couple of new capabilities too. And so one is a checkpoint restart, which is, I guess people have mentioned before, but it basically makes it easier to kind of back up your data and have reliability. And you can actually have a higher reliability with the cloud than with a grid. And the dynamic workload migration, which is very interesting. Once you get a problem to a certain size, you can actually expand the number of CPUs you're using dynamically as you're solving this problem. So this is really interesting, where you don't even set what number of nodes you're going to start using, but it basically dynamically scales to whatever you need. And some of this work is by Josh from VMware, but there's been some research done on looking at specific type of problems and looking at the scalability and the performance of that. And actually, some of these bars in that small graph you'll see there, but I'm not an expert in this, but those bars are 5 or 6 different methods. A couple of them include cloud computing and virtualized machines, and really the performance is almost the same. Obviously, there are situations where it's not, but if you pose your problem in the right way and understand where the difficulties are, you can overcome many of these. So how does it specifically for computer-aided engineering change what we're actually doing? Well, in basic applications, it just gives you this computing power and lets engineers be able to kick off 100 runs of different airfoil shapes at the same time it would take you to solve one. So that's a really big benefit. And yes, this can be done on a grid, but the reality is Boeing's not going to invest in clusters that are so large that you really have an unlimited scalability in the type of problems you're solving. You can also do more complex implementations. So basically, with multidisciplinary optimization, like I mentioned before, some of those are just not possible with the scale of grid computing. So with cloud, those are possible. And I think there's new possibilities of even more advanced type of computations that people haven't even thought of to do just because the computational requirements are so big. So this is a little bit more about the work specifically on the 787 wing, and a lot of this comes from my thesis in multidisciplinary optimization at the University of Washington. But basically, it's the same process. You start with the concept, the detailed design. For the analysis disciplines, this is where we, basically hack together a bunch of the different processes and the computational tools to do simulation for different structural analysis, aerodynamics, and manufacturing constraints, things like that. Link those together, come up with a final design, and go to production. And so some of this work was also done at Boeing and eventually applied on the derivative airplane. And the results were pretty astounding. So we're doing this on a design that's actually already been, basically finalized by Boeing as the best possible design. And we were able to save hundreds of millions of dollars in performance improvement. And how we're able to do this is slight increases in performance, for example, in weight, for Boeing save, thousands of dollars per plane. So when you're selling 1,000 planes, this quickly adds up. But these designs are difficult to optimize. But we really saw a lot of benefits from integrating the processes and being able to capture those interdependencies. More importantly, we're actually able to reduce a lot of the development time. So this is exactly where, we think the market can really take advantage of this, is being able to reduce the time to do the product development. Now, I'm not going to say that all the issues, for example, with 787, are coming from simulation type of tools and things like that. But if you're able to do the core product development processes much, much faster, it obviously reduces your risk of a delay. So now a little bit more about the architecture that we're developing and a lot of what we have developed to do this. So within the architecture, we basically have four main pieces. One is data. This is basically just cloud databases. But the big difference is they're dynamic, real-time. Engineers in different organizations can all link to the same databases and look at what's going on real time, make sure you have real-time data. And it captures also the different relationships between the different models. So something like computational fluid dynamics is very different than finite element analysis, but between the two, there's many things that are in common, for example, geometry. Analysis, and this is where we link into third-party tools. So we link into all the leading kind of software providers to do this analysis. And we work together with them to be able to provide, the leading analysis capabilities. Then on the process side, we partner with different organizations. Also, things like MATLAB and other tools are available, and we use relatively simple algorithms. So these are extremely scalable. In optimization, often you're just doing derivatives and compounding those together. It's relatively simple math, but it's at extremely large scale. And lastly, it's the computing piece, and this is basically where we move this to the cloud. Most of our work has been done with Amazon Web Services, but there's many different vendors that are available to do this, and we're basically just trying to provide the architecture to be able to put this on the cloud. So as somebody mentioned before, I think it was Mike Franklin, about the importance of people on the side. So we also have many interfaces for people to interact with these processes that are happening. One is a metrics dashboard that's more for kind of management to see what's going on. We have an engineering portal that lets you interface and see real time what's happening as you're running this entire process. Then an API interface, so that lets you really just integrate anything you want. So especially in defense, there might be certain type of proprietary codes that you don't want to share, or you can integrate those yourself and program in what you want. And then there's an IT dashboard to keep track of the IT side for the organization. So what benefits does this really get you in the end? So for management, the biggest thing is cost reductions. but especially increased visibility control, being able to do things faster. And most of the cost reduction is actually not as much from the just the standard kind of grid to cloud cost savings, but a lot of it is about more efficient use of your most expensive resources, which are often the people. And then engineers benefit the most. So from doing this type of work on the cloud, it's actually much easier to collaborate across across the world. So with the 787 program, many of the pieces, or most of the pieces, are not actually even produced in the United States. So with the wing, it's built in Japan. So interfacing with a Japanese engineer and some other suppliers becomes much easier when everybody's using the same system and can understand why design choices are made a certain way. So finally, a little bit about, I guess this is about cloud future. So what I see as the future, and this is just my opinion, but I think a lot of people right now are working on, as am I partially, moving existing applications to the cloud and doing just extremely big data, so data that's been around, and doing simple processes on that data. But where I see the future really going is, and we're trying to create that a bit with this infrastructure, is being able to solve new types of problems, being able to improve products, not just do things faster, but do things smarter. And as was mentioned before too by Jim, about being data-driven research. So the results you get out of one of these extremely large multidisciplinary optimization is just a new wing design. But understanding how all the things interact with each other and why this new design is better than the previous design, that's really the biggest benefit that you get out of this. And especially in research, it's a hugely beneficial. And eventually, it's all about moving towards being able to not just scale everything and make everything highly parallelizable, but being able to do this at extremely complex algorithms and computationally very intense processes. I think that's where the future is going, and that's where we're trying to go. So thanks for listening. I'd love to hear any questions that people have.
Thank you, Joris. This is great. This is really good. This explains why I haven't been able to get on a 787 yet. And it also gives me hope for the 797. I mean, it's going to really be optimized, and the process will. Are there any questions?
I just wanted to comment. I think this is a fantastic talk, and it illustrates a couple of things that are obvious, but people often neglect. One is that Dave Patterson years ago pointed out that the cool thing about cloud services is that 1,000 processors for one day costs the same as one processor for 1,000 days, right? Yeah. And that's really the point that you made implicitly, and it's a huge point. The other thing is that you can achieve parallelism through things like parameter sweeps, as opposed to trying to parallelize the algorithms, right? So both of those things seem really important. It's just a great case study.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Right over here.
Yes, I'm wondering if Boeing is engaged with Amazon in a private cloud arrangement. Is that how you solve your security problems? You're not using a public cloud.
Yeah, so just to be clear, first of all, I don't work for Boeing anymore. Right. I just graduated last week.
Great, congratulations.
Thanks. So the cloud work we're doing now, this is work research I did on the side while attending Harvard. We'd like to get Boeing to use it. A lot of the work in the case study, that was all done on grids, but we've basically shown that we can get that capability to the cloud. So actually, right now I'm starting a startup to be able to do this. But right now, Boeing doesn't do any kind of cloud computation yet. And I think it's going to take a little time, and probably there's other people that will probably move first. But at the end of the day, if you look at things like Salesforce, people are comfortable with their most sensitive data within companies on the cloud. So I think eventually aerospace and other industries will move there too.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Joris, thank you very much. It was a very fascinating case study.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Let's give him a hand, please.